Our webinars have taken us from a small group of believers expectantly looking for the birth of the Messiah. We've gone through Jesus' childhood and an exhausting 3.5 ministry for our Lord. And we find now the Son of God betrayed and hanging upon a cross, crucified between two criminals, and ironically being accused of being the King of the Jews, something he will be one day soon. And the Gospels give us a little bit of a timeline of those agonizing last hours. It started with multiple trials before the Jewish and Roman leaders. And after a long night, Jesus is ultimately condemned to death. And he's delivered to the soldiers early the next morning. And the Gospel of Mark tells us that he was crucified at the 3rd hour. That's about 9 o'clock in the morning as we would understand it. And Mark goes on to provide some more details. He tells us that 3 hours later, at the 6th hour, there was a darkness that came over the land. And that darkness at 6 o'clock translates to noon. So when the sun should have been shining bright, there's this unusual darkness that descends, an eerie dark silence that must have worried those who were nearby. And that darkness lasts for about 3 hours until Jesus cries out and takes his last breath. And so Jesus dies at the 9th hour, 6 hours after being crucified. And really, what an agonizing 6 hours that must have been for Jesus. It's hard to imagine Jesus being in that state for so long. And yet, God was really merciful to his beloved Son. God shortened the time. When Joseph of Arimathea goes to ask for the body of Jesus that he might give it a proper burial, Pilate marvels that he's already dead. And that's some evidence that crucifixion would have normally taken a lot longer. But nonetheless, what an incredible 6 hours. And the Gospels give us quite a few details of what took place during that time. Jesus had conversation with the thief that was with him on the cross. Those that passed by mocked Jesus. The soldiers at the foot of the cross parted his garments. Some of the women and the disciples that followed Jesus watched from below. Jesus asked John to care for his mother. A centurion expresses his faith. And finally, Jesus takes his last breath after speaking the last words, "It is finished." But the question we might have is, what was going on in Jesus' mind during those 6 long hours? What was he thinking about? How did he feel? Did he have any doubts about what was happening? Well, this is where the Old Testament fills in the gap that the 4 gospel messages leave. So time and time again, we found that a knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures provides an extra level of detail when we study the life of Christ. And so as we've introduced before, we have these Messianic Psalms. There's a group of Psalms in the Old Testament that provide insights that are not anywhere else. They're Messianic Psalms that relate to Christ. And even though they were written hundreds of years ago, they speak of events that were happening around Jesus, the things that were happening at the foot of the cross. They contain the actual words that were spoken, maybe by Jesus himself or by those that were his enemies. And they describe feelings that Jesus felt. And this is what I really want to focus on tonight, is that they excitingly provide details of what Jesus was thinking. So we have these incredible Psalms like Psalm 22 and Psalm 31 and Psalm 69 that are well known. And they're the ones that contain the thoughts and words of Jesus. They're spoken in the first person, and yet the New Testament identifies that they are the words of Jesus, even though they were written long before Jesus was born. They're his words and they're his thoughts. And we're going to take a look at Psalm 69, and our plan is to consider Jesus' thoughts on the cross. But before we do, think just for a minute, why did God choose to share Jesus' thoughts this way? Why separate Jesus' thoughts from the actual events? We probably would have included them within the Gospels, maybe have an aside or a parenthesis within the Gospels to explain what Jesus was thinking. Why place them in the Psalms? And why reveal them hundreds of years in advance? Why use the pen of David and Asaph to record them long before Jesus lived? Well, I think God had a purpose, and that purpose benefits at least two groups of people. The first being Jesus himself, and the second being us. So if we think just for a moment, by recording them in advance and placing them in the Hebrew scriptures, Jesus had a chance and access to read and meditate upon them. And so the Psalms prepared Jesus for what he needed to do. And as the events took place all around him, they would have given him strength. They even provided him with words to pray and thoughts to think about and meditate upon. And ultimately, we see them as a strength to Jesus in his last hours. And beyond that, the Psalms are beneficial for you and I, because they give us insight into Jesus' spiritual mind and how he overcame temptation. And they provide us confidence that the Bible is divinely inspired. Imagine how God was able to inspire David, say, to write words that were sensible and applicable to him, and at the same time were applicable to Jesus hundreds of years later. You see, that's one of the ultimate proofs of God's foreknowledge. And so the Messianic Psalms provide irrefutable evidence of God's omniscience. And that's a word that means, that God knows everything. So let me take you through Psalm 69. And I think you're going to be thrilled to see the connections. And even though this psalm is amazing, all the other Messianic Psalms are equally incredible. So as we read through these verses, just try to remember that these were written by David. So our first indication that this psalm, Psalm 69, refers to Jesus is found in verse 3. Just like Psalm 22, it refers to Jesus being thirsty. And from what we understand about crucifixion, this was one of the main traits of those that were crucified. And the Gospel of John provides us the parallel. In John chapter 19, Jesus proclaims, "I thirst." And the amazing part of this is that Jesus speaks it aloud. And I think what Jesus wanted was that everyone who was there to recognize the parallel to the Psalms that they should have known. Because we're told here that Jesus said this to fulfill Scripture. When we jump down to the next verse, verse 4, the psalm goes on to speak of Jesus' accusers. All around him were these men who hated him. But they didn't hate him because he'd done something wrong. They hated him because he was sinless. There was no guile in his mouth. The hatred, as the psalm says, was unfounded. And so Jesus quotes this in John 15 before he goes to the cross. He's telling his disciples that the people hated both him and God, his Father, because of what he taught and because of what he did. And Jesus would have witnessed this from the cross. And he would have taken comfort in knowing that he was not on the cross because of some sin that he had committed, but because he had lived a perfect life. We jump down a few more verses to verse 11. Now remember, this entire psalm is about Jesus. We're just pointing out some of the most obvious connections. And this one would have been very evident during Jesus' life, but particularly so while he hung upon the cross. All that passed by reviled and mocked him. It wasn't just the rulers that hated him, but the ordinary citizens as well. So Matthew 27 tells us that everyone who passed by reviled him, wagging their heads, and likewise the chief priests mocking him. He was a proverb to the people. And then we come to the most precise of the parallels that are in Psalm 69, where Jesus proclaimed his thirst. And there at the cross were some ready to respond. They found a pole and a sponge, and they put vinegar on it, and they gave it him to drink. A bitter drink, perhaps intended to deaden the pain, but Jesus would have none of it. It says he would not drink. And we think of Matthew chapter 27, that they gave him vinegar to drink mixed with gall. So there's the exact reference from Psalm 69. So all these connections provide clear evidence that this psalm is messianic, very applicable to Jesus' time on the cross. But there's a little bit more, because there's some parallels that were fulfilled earlier in his life. In verse 8, we're told that he became a stranger to his brethren. And there were many times in Jesus' ministry. In the beginning, there were many stages to Jesus' ministry. In the beginning, there was popularity. He performed great miracles. He healed the sick. Everyone was impressed with his revolutionary teaching. But as the ministry continued, the tide turns against him. The leaders were threatened. The people couldn't understand his message. He wasn't delivering them from Rome. And so even his family turned against him. It says in John 7 that his brethren didn't even believe in him. And Jesus would have contemplated this as he hung upon the cross. And this is alluded to when he speaks to his mother from the cross, and he entrusts the care of his mother to one of his disciples, to the care of John. And then in verse 9, the zeal of thine house has eaten me up. This is a verse that's quoted when Jesus casts the money changers from the temple in Jerusalem. And so Jesus would have been thinking through all the events of his life. These are the thoughts that would have passed through his mind, even though they happened earlier. And what we have then is pretty ample proof that Psalm 69 is applicable to Jesus. It's a record of what he was thinking about on the cross. And what I want to point out is that what we have is an incredible proof of God's foreknowledge. God knows absolutely everything. And only God could have inspired David to write these words that would have double application. It makes me think of a verse that describes God's omniscience. It says in Romans chapter 4 that God calleth those things that be not as though they were. He was able to describe these events and these thoughts hundreds of years before they happened. It's what sets God apart from others. He knows the end from the beginning. Notice the other attribute of God that sets him apart. He can raise the dead. It's very applicable to what's going to happen right after, in a few days after the crucifixion. So our God is both all-powerful and all-knowing. So that's really the takeaway, that the Bible was written and inspired by God. And we have this amazing proof that God had a plan from day one that involved his son, and he's able to weave that into the Psalms hundreds of years in advance. He had a plan 4,000 years before his son was given as a sacrifice, and he weaves it throughout the scriptures. But I want to leave you with one other concept, because once you understand that Psalm 69 is messianic, that it does refer to Jesus, what you can do is you can read the rest of the psalm. And I encourage you to do that, because it will give you amazing insights into what Jesus was thinking about, what was going through his mind. And what I've pointed out so far are the thoughts and events that are recorded in the Gospels. But what's left now is totally new information, details not given in the New Testament accounts. The Psalms are like a fifth gospel. And so here's some of the things that I picked up in Psalm 69 as I think about what Jesus was thinking about. Verse 2, Jesus says, and we've quoted part of it, that his throat was dried, that he was thirsty, but Jesus also said he was weary of crying. We have evidence of his emotion. You see, the things Jesus was going through, they were real. They were real temptations and trials. Hebrews 5 tells us that he had strong crying and tears. Verse 13, we see his dependence on prayer. In verse 15, he talks about the fact that he doesn't want the pit to shut her mouth upon him. He's referring to the grave. And we think of the prayer in the garden that he wished that there could be another way, but he was willing to do it God's way. In verse 20, we're told that he looked for some to take pity, but there was none. You know, Jesus had to bear this alone. Almost all of his disciples had forsaken him. And in fact, Jesus spends most of his last days not being strengthened by his disciples, but preparing them and strengthening them for the time that they would lose him. What Jesus had were these Psalms to give him strength and hope. And even this verse, which really might come as a bit of a surprise to you once you attribute it to Christ, is that Jesus is thinking about the fact that God would pour out indignation upon those that had put him to death. Perhaps we only think of Jesus' words, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." But there were those who knew what they were doing. And for them, Jesus prayed for God's judgment because, you know, forgiveness is not universal. Unfortunately, part of God's righteous plan involves holding those who are wicked accountable. And these are all things that Jesus understood. So when you connect Psalm 69 and Psalm 22 and other Messianic Psalms with the New Testament, we get a much fuller picture of what was accomplished on the cross. Now, I want to conclude in John's Gospel. We're in the final moments of Jesus' life. It's the very end. And there's, I think, an interesting description that we should contemplate just for a moment. So here in John 19, Jesus has been on the cross for 6 hours. His thirst had probably been intense for some time. But what it says is that Jesus, when he knew that all things were now accomplished. Well, what does that mean? Well, it meant that everything in Psalm 69 and in Psalm 22 and in Psalm 31 and all the other Psalms and all the other scriptures, all those things that Jesus knew so well, Jesus knew that they had been accomplished. God's work was fulfilled. But as he's thinking about it, there's one thing that hasn't quite happened. They haven't offered me that sponge filled with vinegar. And so what does Jesus do? He exclaims, I thirst. He understood that Psalm 69 needed to be accomplished. How in tune was Jesus, even in this agony upon the cross, with the will of his Father? And so after he had received the vinegar, Jesus spoke his final words. He said, it's finished. Everything's been accomplished. And at that moment, he gave up the ghost, or as we understand it, he gave up the breath of life. He took his last breath because Jesus had accomplished everything that God had determined and revealed to him in the Old Testament. He'd lived that life completely without sin, completely in service to his God. And in doing so, Jesus brought salvation for you and I. It's a wonderful story, and for me, it just really comes alive when you're able to connect it with Psalm 69 and others. So thank you very much for joining us this evening.